Good morning, book lovers. Welcome to session 7 of the guided reading of Anne Brontë's Agnes Grey. I hope you've been enjoying our sessions together, reading this very significant title in Victorian literature. Now, do you have your cup of tea or cup of coffee ready? If you do, sit here with us and let's continue our reading. Today, we're going to read chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12 is called The Shower, and chapter 13 is called The Primroses. But before we do that, you know how it works. Let's catch up. Let's think about what we read and discussed in our last session. So things are getting really interesting now. I'm very curious to know how the relationship between Agnes and Mr. Weston will develop. Now, if you don't remember who Mr. Weston is, he's the new curate. He's the new clergyman that has arrived, and he seems to be quite an interesting person, at least in Agnes's opinion. So last time we read the chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is called The Church. And in this chapter, we read about the conversation between Miss Murray, the oldest, and Agnes, and how they talk about the new curate, Mr. Weston. And it's very funny to compare their perspectives on life and on men, right? What kind of men they would consider either attractive or, in Agnes's case, not even attractive, but a relevant presence in her life. So Agnes really likes his simplicity and humility and how he preaches evangelical truths. So they watched him preaching on a Sunday afternoon, and she was very pleased with what she experienced, especially in comparison with the previous curate and Mr. Hatfield, right? And in this chapter, Agnes compares Mr. Weston to the pompous, artificial style of the old curate, Mr. Hatfield, who's not that old, right? And this man who wears silk and gold rings and performs a theatrical ritual on the pulpit, flatters the rich families and preaches obedience from the poor to the rich. Remember, we talked about how much of a strong influence the clergyman had on a community, right? And this clergyman here is preaching things that should not be preached, right? So he's, especially to the congregation, to the working class, they would come and listen to his sermons and would really believe in their inferiority to the rich people, right? And would really believe they owed obedience and gratitude to the richer families. They would not believe in their own worth, or even, let alone their autonomy to read the Bible or to consider themselves worthy of any attention or even God's love, right? But with Mr. Weston is different. So I'm very curious about how he will change the community, the congregation, and what kind of companion he will be for Agnes. They haven't met yet, but we know this is an older narrator looking back. And from what the narrator says, we can we can infer that they will meet. And it will not be a brief meeting. It will be something meaningful for both of them. And the next chapter, that was chapter 11, The Cottagers. That was a very interesting one, a longer one. And in this chapter, Agnes visits the cottagers to fulfill promises made by the Mrs. Murray, who would visit the poor to amuse themselves. So when they had nothing else to do, they would go out and visit the poor, but not because of the goodness of their hearts, no, but because they wanted to amuse themselves and to be admired by the poor people and to have their presence appreciated. And they would, give promises false promises of coming back to read for them or to give them a gift. And most of the time, it was Agnes who would need to fulfill their own promises. So she comes to visit an old lady who's ill called Nancy Brown. Agnes comes to talk and reads to her. And this lady tells Agnes about Mr. Weston's visits, something she did not expect, that Mr. Weston would visit the poor, and not just in a hurried way like Mr. Hatfield, but he would really go there to talk to the people, have meaningful conversations, and to stay there for a while. And she tells Agnes how Mr. Weston helped her see religion as comforting and God as benevolent, different from Mr. Hatfield, who scared her with God's condemnation. And now Agnes, deprived of love and of morally and intellectual enriching conversations, she sees in Mr. Weston hope. Now, this is where we left off last time. Let's continue with chapter 12 called The Shower. The next visit I paid to Nancy Brown was in the second week in March. For though I had many spare minutes during the day, I seldom could look upon an hour as entirely my own, since where everything was left to the caprices of Miss Mathilda and her sister, there could be no order or regularity, and whatever occupation I chose, when not actually busied about them or their concerns, I had, as it were, to keep my loins girded, my shoes on my feet, and my staff in my hand, for not to be immediately forthcoming when called for, was regarded as a grave and inexcusable offense, not only by my pupils and their mother, but by the very servant who came in breathless haste to call me, exclaiming, "You are to go to the schoolroom directly, ma'am. The young ladies in waiting." Climax of horror, actually waiting for their governess. And here, let's take a look at the footnote. Well, she never knew when they would call, so she couldn't really enjoy her own time because she didn't know if it was going to last a minute or an hour or 5, right? So this is actually a quotation from the Bible. To keep my loins girded, my shoes on my feet, and my staff in my hand. But this time I was pretty sure of an hour or 2 to myself, for Matilda was preparing for a long ride, and Rosalie was dressing for a dinner party at Lady Ashby's. So I took the opportunity of repairing to the widow's cottage, where I found her in some anxiety about her cat, which had been absent all day. I comforted her with as many anecdotes of that animal's roving propensities as I could recollect. "I'm feared of the gamekeepers," said she. And now, if you're wondering what gamekeepers are, men hired for duties related to hunting on estates, including breeding game for shooting and keeping poachers and vermin off the property. So she was afraid that these men would get the cat. So I'm feared of the gamekeepers. That's all I think on. If the young gentlemen had been at home, I should have thought they'd been setting their dogs at her and worried her, poor thing, as they did many a poor thing's cat. But I haven't that to be feared on now. Nancy's eyes were better, but still far from well. She had been trying to make a Sunday shirt for her son, but told me she could only bear to do a little bit at it now and then, so that it progressed but slowly, though the poor lad wanted it sadly. So I proposed to help her a little after I had read to her, for I had plenty of time that evening and need not return till dusk. She thankfully accepted the offer. "And you'll be a bit of company for me too, miss," said she. "I like as I feel lonesome without my cat." But when I had finished reading and done the half a seam with Nancy's capacious breast thimble fitted onto my finger by means of a roll of paper, I was disturbed by the entrance of Mr. Weston with the identical cat in his arms. I now saw that he could smile, and very pleasantly so. "I've done you a piece of good service, Nancy," he began. Then seeing me, he acknowledged my presence by a slight bow. I should have been invisible to Mr. Hatfield or any other gentleman of those parts. I have delivered your cat, he continued, from the hands, or rather the gun, of Mr. Murray's gamekeeper. God bless you, sir, cried the grateful old woman, ready to weep for joy as she received her favorite from his arms. Take care of it, said he, and don't let it go near the rabbit warren, for the gamekeeper swears he'll shoot it if he sees it there again. He would have done so today if I had not been in time to stop him. I believe it is raining, Miss Grey, added he more quietly, observing that I had put aside my work and was preparing to depart. Don't let me disturb you. I shan't stay 2 minutes. You'll both stay while this shower gets over, said Nancy as she stirred the fire and placed another chair beside it. What? There's room for all. I can see better here, thank you, Nancy, replied I, taking my work to the window, where she had the goodness to suffer me to remain unmolested while she got a brush to remove the cat's hairs from Mr. Weston's coat, carefully wiped the rain from his hat, and gave the cat its supper, busily talking all the time, now thanking her clerical friend for what he had done, now wondering how the cat had found out the warren, and now lamenting the probable consequences of such discovery. He listened with a quiet, good-natured smile, and at length took a seat in compliance with her pressing invitations, but repeated that he did not mean to stay. I have another place to go to, said he, and I see, glancing at the book on the table, someone else has been reading to you. Yes, sir, Miss Grey has been as kind as read me a chapter, and now she's helping me with a shirt for our Bill, but I'm feared she'll be cold there. Won't you come to the fire, miss? No, thank you, Nancy. I'm quite warm. I must go as soon as this shower is over. Ah, miss, you said you could stop while dusk, cried the provoking old woman, and Mr. Weston seized his hat. Nay, sir, exclaimed she, pray don't go now while it rains so fast. But it strikes me I'm keeping your visitor away from the fire. No, you're not, Mr. Weston, replied I, hoping there was no harm in a falsehood of that description. No, sure, cried Nancy. What, there's lots of room. Miss Grey, said he, half jestingly, as if he felt it necessary to change the present subject, whether he had anything particular to say or not. I wish you would make peace with the squire when you see him. He was by when I rescued Nancy's cat and did not quite approve of the deed. I told him I thought he might better spare all his rabbits than she her cat, for which audacious assertion he treated me to some rather ungentlemanly language, and I fear I retorted a trifle too warmly. Oh, lawful sir, I hope you didn't fall out with the maester for sake of my cat. He cannot bite answering again, can the maester? Oh, it's no matter, Nancy. I don't care about it, really. I said nothing very uncivil. And I suppose Mr. Murray is accustomed to use rather strong language when he's heated. Aye, sir, it's a pity. And now I really must go. I have to visit a place a mile beyond this, and you would not have me to return in the dark. Besides, it has nearly done raining now. So, good evening, Nancy. Good evening, Miss Grey. Good evening, Mr. Weston. But don't depend upon me for making your peace with Mr. Murray, for I never see him to speak to. Don't you? It can't be helped, then, replied he in dolorous resignation. Then, with a peculiar half-smile, he added, but never mind. I imagine the squire has more to apologize for than I, and left the cottage. I went on with my sewing as long as I could see, and then bid Nancy good evening, checking her too lively gratitude by the undeniable assurance that I had only done for her what she would have done for me if she had been in my place, and I in hers, and hastened back to Horton Lodge, where, having entered the schoolroom, I found the tea-table all in confusion, the tray flooded with slops, and Miss Matilda in a most ferocious humour. Miss Grey, whatever have you been about? I've had tea half an hour ago, and had to make it myself, and drink it all alone. I wish you would come in sooner. I've been to see Nancy Brown. I thought you would not be back from your ride." "Now, how could I ride in the rain, I should like to know? That devil-putting shower was vexatious enough, coming on when I was just in full swing, and then to come and find nobody in to tea, and you know I can't make the tea as I like it." "I didn't think of the shower," replied I, and indeed the thought of its driving her home had never entered my head. "No, of course you were under shelter yourself, and you never thought of all the people." The hypocrisy in this assertion. Right? I bore her coarse reproaches with astonishing equanimity, even with cheerfulness, for I was sensible that I had done more good to Nancy Brown than harm to her, and perhaps some other thoughts assisted to keep up my spirits and impart a relish to the cup of cold, overdrawn tea, and a charm to the otherwise unsightly table, and, I had almost said, to Miss Matilda's unamiable face. But she soon betook herself to the stables and left me to the quiet enjoyment of my solitary meal. And this is the end of chapter 12, called The Shower. It's short, but I really, really like it. So it's the first encounter between Miss Grey and Mr. Weston, I mean, face to face. They know of each other, as you can see, because they know each other's names. It was a very short stay. It was raining, so he stayed for 2 minutes. But the way he said that he saved the cat, he saved old Nancy Brown's cat, and got the squire angry. And the squire is, of course, Agnes's master, her employer, the owner of Horton Lodge. He said he would rescue the cat, even though that made the squire angry, because he would rather his dogs have their own way instead of rescuing the cat of an old lady that would that was there where the rabbits were, right? So, and she said she couldn't help him make peace with the squire because she never speaks to him really. And he says then with a smile, "Well, it can't be helped then." And at that moment, I think there was an instant connection between the two. Don't you think? All right, so we'll continue now with chapter 13, called The Primroses. Miss Murray now always went twice to church, for she so loved admiration that she could not bear to lose a single opportunity of obtaining it, and she was so sure of it wherever she showed herself that whether Harry Meltham and Mr. Green were there or not, there was certain to be somebody present who would be not insensible to her charms, besides the rector, whose official capacity generally obliged him to attend. Usually also, if the weather permitted, both she and her sister would walk home. Matilda because she hated the confinement of the carriage. She because she disliked the privacy of it, and enjoyed the company that generally enlivened the first mile of the journey in walking from the church to Mr. Green's park gates, near which commenced the private road to Horton Lodge, which lay in the opposite direction. While the highway conducted in a straightforward course to the still more distant mansion of Sir Hugh Meltham. Thus, there was always a chance of being accompanied so far either by Harry Meltham, with or without Miss Meltham, or Mr. Green, with perhaps one or both of his sisters, and any gentlemen visitors they might have. Whether I walked with the young ladies or rode with their parents depended entirely upon their own capricious will. If they chose to take me, I went. If, for some reasons best known to themselves, they chose to go alone, I took my seat in the carriage. I liked walking better, but a sense of reluctance to obtrude my presence on any one who did not desire it always kept me passive on this and similar occasions, and I never inquired into the causes of their varying whims. And indeed, this was the best policy, for to submit and oblige was the governess's part. To submit and oblige. To consult their own pleasure was that of the pupils. But when I did walk, this first half of the journey was generally a great nuisance to me, as none of the before-mentioned ladies and gentlemen ever noticed me. It was disagreeable to walk beside them, as if listening to what they said, or wishing to be thought one of them, while they talked over me or across me, and if their eyes in speaking chanced to fall on me, it seemed as if they looked on vacancy, as if they either did not see me or were very desirous to make it appear so. Can you imagine? It's a very invisible existence, and it must be very hard to be reminded of your own insignificance in their own view, right? In the other's view, all the time. So being next to people, but not being noticed, being spoken over, and even looked at as if they did not see her on purpose. It was disagreeable, too, to walk behind and thus appear to acknowledge my own inferiority. For in truth, I considered myself pretty nearly as good as the best of them, and wished them to know that I did so, and not to imagine that I looked upon myself as a mere domestic, who knew her own place too well to walk beside such fine ladies and gentlemen as they were. Though her young ladies might choose to have her with them, and even condescend to converse with her when no better company were at hand. Thus, I am almost ashamed to confess it, but indeed I gave myself no little trouble in my endeavors, if I did keep up with them, to appear perfectly unconscious or regardless of their presence, as if I were wholly absorbed in my own reflections or the contemplations of surrounding objects. Or if I lingered behind, it was some bird or insect, some tree or flower that attracted my attention, and having duly examined that, I would pursue my walk alone at a leisurely pace, until my pupils had bid adieu to their companions and turned off into the quiet, private road. One such occasion I particularly well remember. It was a lovely afternoon about the close of March. Mr. Green and his sisters had sent their carriage back empty in order to enjoy the bright sunshine and balmy air in a sociable walk home along with their visitors, Captain Somebody and Lieutenant Somebody else, a couple of military fops, and the Mrs. Murray, who, of course, contrived to join them. I think it's really nice that this book is written in the first narrative because we get a glimpse at Agnes's own feelings. So despite everyone, or mostly everyone, thinking she was inferior to them, she keeps her head high. And even if they're not conversing with her, she pretends to be examining a bird or a tree or lost in her own reflections. And when she mentions this military man, she couldn't care less about them. She even calls them Captain Somebody and Lieutenant Somebody else. Such a party was highly agreeable to Rosalie, but not finding it equally suitable to my taste, I presently fell back and began to botanize and entomologize along the green banks and budding hedges, till the company was considerably in advance of me, and I could hear the sweet song of the happy lark. Then my spirit of misanthropy began to melt away beneath the soft, pure air and genial sunshine. But sad thoughts of early childhood and yearnings for departed joys or for a brighter future lot arose instead. As my eyes wandered over the steep banks covered with young grass and green-leaved plants, and surmounted by budding hedges, I longed intensely for some familiar flower that might recall the woody dales or green hillsides of home. The brown moorlands, of course, were out of the question. Such a discovery would make my eyes gush out with water, no doubt, but that was one of my greatest enjoyments now. At length I descried, high up between the twisted roots of an oak, 3 lovely primroses, peeping so sweetly from their hiding place that the tears already started at the sight, but they grew so high above me that I tried in vain to gather 1 or 2 to dream over and to carry with me. I could not reach them unless I climbed the bank, which I was deterred from doing by hearing a footstep at that moment behind me, and was therefore about to turn away when I was startled by the words, "Allow me to gather them for you, Miss Grey," spoken in the grave, low tones of a well-known voice. Immediately the flowers were gathered and in my hand. It was Mr. Weston, of course. Who else would trouble himself to do so much for me? I thanked him, whether warmly or coldly I cannot tell, but certain I am that I did not express half the gratitude I felt. It was foolish, perhaps, to feel my gratitude at all, but it seemed to me at that moment as if this were a remarkable instance of his good nature, an act of kindness which I could not repay, but never should forget. So utterly unaccustomed was I to receive such civilities, so little prepared to expect them from anyone within 50 miles of Horton Lodge. It's Mr. Weston again, of course. Who else would even consider her well-being, right? And it is such a trivial thing, picking up the flowers for her. But she has been used to feeling neglected, abandoned, that trivial act of collecting the flowers for her meant so much more than she could express with gratitude. Yet this did not prevent me from feeling a little uncomfortable in his presence, and I proceeded to follow my pupils at a much quicker pace than before. Though perhaps if Mr. Weston had taken the hint and let me pass without another word, I might have repented it an hour after. But he did not. A somewhat rapid walk for me was but an ordinary pace for him. "Your young ladies have left you alone," said he. "Yes, they are occupied with more agreeable company." "Then don't trouble yourself to overtake them." I slackened my pace, but next moment regretted having done so. My companion did not speak, and I had nothing in the world to say, and feared he might be in the same predicament. At length, however, he broke the pause by asking, with a certain quiet abruptness peculiar to himself, if I liked flowers. "Yes, very much," I answered, "wild flowers especially." "I like wild flowers," said he. "Others I don't care about, because I have no particular associations connected with them, except one or two." "What are your favorite flowers?" "Primroses, bluebells, and heath blossoms." "Not violets?" "No, because, as you say, I have no particular associations connected with them, for there are no sweet violets among the hills and valleys around my home." "It must be a great consolation to you to have a home, Miss Grey," observed my companion after a short pause. "However remote, or however seldom visited, still it is something to look to." "It is so much that I think I could not live without it," replied I with an enthusiasm of which I immediately repented, for I thought it must have sounded essentially silly. "Oh, yes, you could," said he with a thoughtful smile. "The ties that bind us to life are tougher than you imagine, or than anyone can, who has not felt how roughly they may be pulled without breaking. You might be miserable without a home, but even you could live, and not so miserably as you suppose. The human heart is like Indian rubber. A little swells it, but a great deal will not burst it. If little more than nothing will disturb it, little less than all things will suffice to break it. As in the outer members of our frame, there is a vital power inherent in itself that strengthens it against external violence. Every blow that shakes it will serve to harden it against a future stroke, as constant labor thickens the skin of the hand and strengthens its muscles instead of wasting them away. So that a day of arduous toil that might excoriate a lady's palm would make no sensible impression on that of a hardy ploughman. I speak from experience, partly my own. There was a time when I thought as you do. At least I was fully persuaded that home and its affections were the only things that made life tolerable. That if deprived of these, existence would become a burden hard to be endured. But now I have no home, unless you would dignify my 2 hired rooms at Horton by such a name. And not 12 months ago I lost the last and dearest of my early friends, and yet not only I live, but I am not wholly destitute of hope and comfort, even for this life. though I must acknowledge that I can seldom enter even an humble cottage at the close of day and see its inhabitants peaceably gathered around their cheerful hearth without a feeling almost of envy at their domestic enjoyment. You don't know what happiness lies before you yet, said I. You are now only in the commencement of your journey. The best of happiness, replied he, is mine already, the power and the will to be useful. We now approached a stile communicating with a footpath that conducted to a farmhouse, where I suppose Mr. Weston purposed to make himself useful, for he presently took leave of me, crossed the stile, and traversed the path with his usual firm, elastic tread, leaving me to ponder his words as I continued my course alone. I had heard before that he had lost his mother not many months before he came. She then was the last and dearest of his early friends, and he had no home. I pitied him from my heart. I almost wept for sympathy. And this, I thought, accounted for the shade of premature thoughtfulness that so frequently clouded his brow and obtained for him the reputation of a morose and sullen disposition with the charitable Miss Murray and all her kin. But, thought I, he is not so miserable as I should be under such a deprivation. He leads an active life, and a wide field for useful exertion lies before him. He can make friends, and he can make a home too, if he pleases, and doubtless he will please some time, and God grant the partner of that home may be worthy of his choice, and make it a happy one, such a home as he deserves to have. And how delightful it would be to— But no matter what I thought. I began this book with the intention of concealing nothing, that those who liked might have the benefit of perusing a fellow creature's heart. But we have some thoughts that all the angels in heaven are welcome to behold, but not our brother men, not even the best and kindest amongst them. So you see how the narrator here interrupts the narrative. So you, the reader, you encounter the narrator in its present time, which for us reading now would be the future, right? So the future Agnes. So she's talking about Mr. Weston, and they had such a nice conversation. They're both away from home, and she was feeling so miserable. But in comparison to him, that has no home, has no friends, has no family, her situation is privileged in comparison. So that makes her feel, at least feel sympathy for him, and how delightful it will be to— Now we may wonder what she was thinking about here, perhaps how wonderful it would be to be that person to provide a home for Mr. Weston as his wife. But there are certain things, some thoughts, that only angels in heaven are welcome to behold. Let's continue. By the time the Greens had taken themselves to their own abode, and the Murrays had turned down the private road, whither I hastened to follow them, I found the two girls lost in an animated discussion on the respective merits of the two young officers. But on seeing me, Rosalie broke off in the middle of a sentence to exclaim with malicious glee, "Oh, Miss Grey, you're come at last, are you? No wonder you lingered so long behind, and no wonder you always stand up so vigorously for Mr. Weston when I abuse him. Aha, I see it all now." "Now come, Miss Murray, don't be foolish," said I, attempting a good-natured laugh. "You know such nonsense can make no impression on me." But she still went on talking such intolerable stuff, her sister helping her with appropriate fictions coined for the occasion, that I thought it necessary to say something in my own justification. "What humbug all this is!" I exclaimed. "If Mr. Weston's road happened to be the same as mine for a few yards, and if he chose to exchange a word or two in passing, what is there so remarkable in that? I assure you I never spoke to him before, except once." "Where? Where, and when?" cried they eagerly. in Nancy's cottage. Aha, you've met him there, have you? Exclaimed Rosalie with exultant laughter. Now, Matilda, I've found out why she's so fond of going to Nancy Brown's. She goes there to flirt with Mr. Weston. Really, that is not worth contradicting. I only saw him there once, I tell you, and how could I know he was coming? Irritated as I was at their foolish mirth and vexatious imputations, the uneasiness did not continue long. When they had had their laugh out, they returned again to the captain and lieutenant, and while they disputed and commented upon them, my indignation rapidly cooled. The cause of it was quickly forgotten, and I turned my thoughts into a pleasanter channel. Thus we proceeded up the park and entered the hall, and as I ascended the stairs to my own chamber, I had but one thought within me. My heart was filled to overflowing with one single earnest wish. Having entered the room and shut the door, I fell upon my knees and offered up a fervent but not impetuous prayer. Thy will be done, I strove to say throughout, but, Father, all things are possible with thee, and may it be thy will, was sure to follow. That wish, that prayer both men and women would have scorned me for. But, Father, thou wilt not despise, I said, and felt that it was true. It seemed to me that another's welfare was at least as ardently implored for as my own. Nay, even that was the principal object of my heart's desire. I might have been deceiving myself, but that idea gave me confidence to ask, and power to hope I did not ask in vain. As for the primroses, I kept 2 of them in a glass in my room until they were completely withered, and the housemaid threw them out, and the petals of the other I pressed between the leaves of my Bible. I have them still, and mean to keep them always. And that is the end of chapter 14, The Primroses. What a beautiful chapter, right? You see the connection between Mr. Weston and Agnes slowly growing. They have a lot in common. So they, for instance, despise the squire, right? The owner of Horton Lodge, Mr. Murray. And they're both alone in the world, although Agnes has a home to return to on holidays. Mr. Weston is completely alone, and here she keeps the flowers that he gathered for them, flowers that remind her of her home, so they are very symbolic flowers. And she chose to keep one of them in between the leaves of her Bible, and they're there still. So that's the future Agnes saying that those leaves, those petals are still there in between the pages of her Bible. Now we wonder what happened to them in this meantime. Has their relationship grown? Has it ended? Or what happened, right? We can infer that it has been a meaningful relationship because even in the future, she keeps those petals as a symbol of her relationship with him, but we don't know more as of yet. And she prays for something at the end of the chapter, right? But it's something that only the angels can know. We don't know what she's praying for. She's asking for somebody else's well-being. So I think, let me know what you think. I think that she's praying, hoping that she could be that person to provide a home and love to Mr. Weston, who needs it so much. All right, so this is the end of this session. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please leave a comment and like this video, share it with other book lovers that you know of that would be interested in reading Agnes Grey. And in our next session, we're going to read chapters 14, also 14 and 15. So Primroses was the end of chapter 13. Correct? Yes. Next time, we're going to read chapter 14 called The Rector, Mr. Weston, and chapter 15, The Walk. Look forward to reading that with you. Have a wonderful, wonderful week and enjoy your reading, and I'll see you next time.